Thanks for listening in. I'm Noah Parrish. I'm the communications director here at Gender Justice, and I'm joined by Jess, our legal director. As many of you know, we had the Supreme Court hear oral arguments in two cases yesterday involving trans inclusion in sports. So we're here today to break down what we heard during oral arguments and what these cases are all about. So thanks, Jess, for making some space in a pretty crazy week here in Minnesota.
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy week to be sitting down and listening to a 3.5 hour oral argument. Um, or to do anything for more than like 5 minutes straight without losing my mind. So, just for posterity, we are currently in the midst of an ICE takeover of Minnesota where really horrific things are happening. Our staff are running around trying to make sure they don't enter schools and daycares and doing mutual aid and work. So forgive us if we're a little not on the ball today. We're going to try to get you this really important information, but that's just some context for what's going on right now.
Yeah, thanks, Jess. Well, let's jump right into it. Can you tell us a little bit first about these two cases that are before the Supreme Court?
Yeah, so there's two separate cases. One is a challenge to Idaho's ban on trans women playing, or trans girls playing girls' sports. Idaho, I believe, was the first state to institute a trans ban in schools through a statute or like a law through the legislature. That was in either late 2019 or early 2020. That's when that went through. And two students actually challenged that law. One is a transgender woman, Lindsay Hecox. The other is an anonymous, a cis girl in high school. So Lindsay Hecox is a trans girl, and she argued basically, look, I play sports, and this law will prevent me from playing sports. The cis girl in the case, again, I'm not using her name because she's anonymous, so I don't know it. It's not public. The cis girl in that case basically argued she's very boyish, as I am, right? Like people often mistake her for male or a boy, and that law would allow people to just call anyone out on the field and do really invasive sex testing on that person. And that cis athlete was very nervous that that could happen to her based on the fact that she gets misgendered all the time. So Hecox is an interesting case because it's a trans girl and a cis girl together challenging that ban. The second case is B.P.J versus West Virginia. That's a middle schooler. West Virginia passed a trans sports ban, and this middle schooler was on the volleyball team and was going to get kicked off. My understanding is, her peers were really happy to have her. Everything was going fine. There weren't any issues. Um, and so BPJ, challenged West Virginia's ban on trans inclusion in sports. So those two cases were heard back to back, with the Hecox, the Idaho case first, and the BPJ West Virginia case second.
Great. I appreciate that breakdown. Thank you. So, for those of us like me who are not expert legal minds like you, tell us more. Like, what are the legal questions that SCOTUS is deciding in these cases?
Yeah, so there's three main issues they're looking at. The first is whether the Hecox, the Idaho case, is moot. A case is moot when there's no more controversy going on. Like whatever it was that gave rise to the case is over and it's not going to happen again. So what happened there is that Lindsay Hecox argues like, look, I'm at this point, like this is so harmful. All I've wanted to do is play sports and I've become this like national figure. This is really miserable. I really just don't want to play sports anymore. And so this issue is moot. I'm not going to play. And so the first question is like, is that case moot? Meaning like, does it just have to be dismissed because there's no controversy anymore? The second question in that case is it really came down to a constitutional equal protection claim. So that case is at what's called the preliminary injunction phase. If you watch gender justice stuff, we go into a little more detail than normal, so that this is maybe for nerds, but like a preliminary injunction is where someone goes into court and tries to get an initial pause or an initial stop on a law. And so that's a really early stage of the case. It could happen within like days of filing. And so there's not much of a record, there's not much information at that point. And what a court is ruling on is whether someone is harmed and whether they're likely to win. It's not even a ruling that you won. It's a ruling like, are you harmed and are you likely to win this case? The court found that she is likely to win this case on equal protection grounds, because when a law classifies based on sex, courts are supposed to subject that law to heightened scrutiny. It's an intermediate scrutiny. And so courts are supposed to carefully scrutinize that law. They're supposed to really make sure it's not the highest level, so it's not like a perfect fit with whatever purpose the government passed the law for the law itself, but there ha does have to be like a really strong reason they enacted that law and a really strong connection between the law itself and that reason. Um, and so the court found that Lindsay Hecox is likely to win on the question of whether Idaho's sports ban violates equal protection. That got appealed, and so that was the focus of the Hecox case. There was a lot of discussion about equal protection, not a lot about mootness, which was surprising. I thought it would be a kind of boring mootness case. But not a ton about mootness. It was mostly about that constitutional claim. The B.P.J. case, similar, it's in an earlier stage. The case hasn't gone to trial or anything, but the issue there, she also brought, equal protection and Title IX claims. The issue there was a lot more discussion in the lower courts about Title IX, and they found she was likely to win on the Title IX claim. So Title IX is a federal anti-discrimination law that bars sex discrimination in schools that receive federal funding. And there are a whole bunch of specific regulations related to sports. And so the question there is like, given Title IX itself and those regulations, um, what does that mean for the trans ban? And so the questions in this case, and I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is the question in this case might just be limited to, can states ban trans girls from girls' sports? It might not reach the question of, do states have to ban trans girls from girls sports? And we're going to talk about that later, but that's a really important distinction. So the question here is really, can schools ban trans girls from girls sports? These students won in the lower courts. The case worked their way over to the U.S. Supreme Court, and that's more or less what the Supreme Court is deciding. It gets a little narrower from there, and we can talk about that.
Thanks, Jess. That's really helpful. So I heard the judges talking about facial challenges versus as applied challenges. What were they talking about, and why is that important?
So when you challenge the constitutionality of a statute of a law, you can say like, this law is just plain constitutional. This law is intended to apply to X population of people, and within that population, there's just no legal way to enforce this. Like, the law just needs to be struck down. You can't have it. A separate kind of claim is an as applied claim. So, for example, if the government bans hats in government buildings, a Jewish person might say, sure, you can ban hats, but like, I have to wear my yarmulke. This infringes on my religious rights. So this law is unconstitutional as applied to me and other Jewish people who have to wear yarmulkes, right? And so that's the difference. They're not saying like you can't ban hats, but they are saying you can't ban yarmulkes, right? So it's an as applied challenge to a specific population of people. There was a lot of discussion here about whether you can bring an as applied challenge, because these laws aren't, they're clearly trans bans, but some of them are just written as banning what they call biological males. I put that in quotes for people listening in audio, people assigned male at birth, from women's sports. So that would include like cis boys can't play women's sports. That's an interesting question all in itself. Title IX actually doesn't force schools to keep cis boys out of women's sports, but we could talk about that. And so the question here is like, how narrow is this case? And especially both of them, they were trying to make it pretty narrow. I would say like B.P.J. was even narrower. Like, what the argument that in B.P.J. it was really narrowly framed as like, if you have a girl who has assigned male at birth, but went on puberty suppressing medication and then went on hormones, like hormone replacement hormones, as in this person never went through, she was assigned male at birth, but never went through what people are commonly referring to as male, what's so-called male puberty. Can you really ban that girl from playing? There's no relationship to the law there because there's no safety concerns, there's no fairness concerns. And it was actually really it's kind of a disheartening place to start the argument. It concedes a whole lot of ground, but I'm not saying this to as a criticism. I'm not being like an armchair attorney here. I think these were really difficult decisions people made based on needing to get certain relief in this case, based on needing to win, based on their audience. So I just want to present the information. But I will say it's just really, really sad that this is the state we're at, where we're where the claim is just so narrow, and we're concerned that the only way we could win is if it's so narrow. Obviously, no one is happy with that. But again, this is not intended as a criticism of the lawyers doing the case. I think people should listen to the audio, read the transcript, consider the context, and decide for themselves how they feel about that as a strategic choice. But I'm just presenting the information so people know what's going on.
Thanks, Jess. So, having listened to all 3.5 hours, what really stood out to you with the oral arguments, what you were hearing from the justices, what you were hearing from the attorneys?
Um, the first thing that stood out to me was just how much ground we had to, our side, the trans inclusion side had to cede just to make their argument to begin with. That was just so, um, it was just very sad and hard to watch, I would say. Um, the other, but this is the state that we're in, our court, the Supreme Court is so bad on these issues right now. So I don't know. I don't know in terms of like if you look at this case from a like, can I peel off a conservative judge if I do this? I don't know the answer. And so again, that's not meant as an attack on any decisions anyone made. It's just hard to watch. Um, the other interesting thing I noticed was Justice Gorsuch, who was quiet during the scrimetti, during the gender affirming care discussion, was really active. And what's interesting about that is he drafted the Bostock argument, which says that trans people are protected under Title VII, which is a similar anti-discrimination law for employment. So it prohibits sex discrimination and other forms of discrimination in employment. He believes that law protects trans people. He was a lot more active in kind of questioning why the athletes brought such narrow claims. Um, it was a little hard to get a full read on it, but I'm actually not sure exactly where he'll come down.
Hmm.
Um, However, after I watched the whole thing, it was 3.5 hours. I'm not super excited about this outcome here. It seems certainly like there's a majority of judges who may allow states to ban trans girls from girls' sports. What's interesting is that during those arguments, they said I believe it was 27 states ban trans girls from girls' sports and 23 states are inclusive. So the
Hmm.
question is, like, what happens, like Minnesota, what happens to those 23 states who are inclusive? And that could still be an open question after this case. And so that's interesting. Again, this is about can states ban trans girls from girls' sports? And judges may not reach the question of do states have to ban trans girls from girls' sports, which would let states go out and do their own thing and make their own decisions. And actually, some conservative judges seemed inclined to want to do that. And so that would be really a really sad outcome overall. But as a practical matter, would allow states like Minnesota to continue to be inclusive.
Yeah, so let's talk about Minnesota. That's where most of our listeners are. We do have some folks in North Dakota too, so maybe you can kind of touch on the
Yeah,
dynamic there
absolutely. I
as
could talk about
well.
North Dakota too.
But what is the law here in Minnesota? We just had that big win in Cooper versus USA Powerlifting. Like, what does this landscape look like for us as much as you can read the tea leaves, knowing these are just oral arguments?
Minnesota is a really strong state for trans inclusive laws and policies, and our government does, the courts don't always get it right. The government doesn't always get it right, but our government is putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to protecting trans folks in the courts. They're challenging gender affirming care bans. Um, they're challenging tr the Trump administration trying to force Minnesota to ban trans girls from girls' sports. And there's an active lawsuit about that, which I can talk about. But
Okay.
Minnesota actually is actively fighting for the rights of trans students to participate in sports. We also have good laws here. The Minnesota Human Rights Act protects trans students from discrimination. There was a case we brought with the ACLU and Stinson, basically arguing against a school, the Anoka Hennepin School District, that forced a trans swimmer, kicked him out of the boys' locker room. He was on the boys' swim team. We got a ruling that the Minnesota Human Rights Act does protect that student. We also got a ruling, as you mentioned, Noah, in Cooper v. USA Powerlifting, that the Minnesota Human Rights Act does protect trans athletes from discrimination in sports. And so that was a Minnesota Supreme Court ruling. We're good there. And so that's and our constitution, so the NH case I mentioned earlier was also a constitutional decision. So our state statutes, our state constitutions protects trans athletes. Of course, the Constitution applies to government actors, so it applies in the context of public schools and government laws and policies. This Minnesota Human Rights Act applies also in private spaces, so it would apply to a recreational sports league, for example, that's not affiliated with a school. And so we have strong protections here. This case, the Hecox and B.P.J case, might not impact Minnesota directly for the reason I said before. It might allow states that choose to be trans inclusive to continue to do that. And so that's one very possible outcome here, even if we lose the case, which would be terrible, is that we still have a ruling that lets us continue to be inclusive in schools in Minnesota.
Yeah. But if they were to broaden, which it sounds like they're not, would that just eliminate our trans sports inclusion law, unfortunately? Okay.
So there's a separate lawsuit about whether Minnesota has violated the law by being trans inclusive. In other words, does trans inclusion violate Title
Mm,
IX? So it's kind of the opposite. It's the flip side of the question. Can states ban trans girls? Can states include trans girls? There is another case on can states include trans girls. Minnesota's at the forefront of this. When the Trump administration tried to make us stop including trans girls in girls' sports, other states capitulated. We did not. We sued them. And so that's the Attorney General's office. And so that lawsuit is going. And that I felt that judges brought that up. Like judges
mm,
in the SCOTUS argument said, hey, to the government, hey, aren't you making this argument in other cases like that states can't decide for themselves? Like, aren't you in other
mm,
cases saying, and the government tried to kind of sidestep it, and they didn't do a good job of that. So SCOTUS did call that out, and I thought they seemed disinclined to want to force. I thought they seemed inclined to want to have states decide. But we've heard that before, and that hasn't turned out to be true. And if you let states decide, then states can ban. And so, as we've seen with like abortion, letting states decide isn't like this great benevolent thing. It's a thing that lets states then trot over people's civil rights and protection. So I also don't want to like be naive, right? It's not a good thing. However, in terms of like what would that do to Minnesota? If states can be trans inclusive, then Minnesota can continue to be trans inclusive, which is good. So the upshot here is that this case could come down. It could come down in a bad way that we don't like, and that would be horrible. However, it might not force Minnesota to stop being trans inclusive. The other interesting thing I just want to point out is that case is about Title IX. That case is about schools. And our win under the Minnesota Human Rights Act is about private sports leagues. So whatever's happening in the courts will not change that ruling about private sports leagues. So Hecox, B.P.J, this Minnesota case over, Title IX and trans inclusion, all of those cases are about the government and schools, not about, excuse me, private organizations. And so that's still an avenue for inclusion here. But of course, most kids access sports through schools. Most kids who can't afford to do private clubs access sports through public schools. And so we really want to see those protections stay in place.
yeah. It's wild to have to be fighting this on so many fronts with so much going on in our community and our country right now. So, a couple questions kind of back to these two Supreme Court cases that we're going to get a decision on June, early July. Is it gonna stay just narrow to sports? Is this gonna impact trans people in any other ways? Or do you suspect it will just stay sports specific? I know that's been a question on a lot of people's
Oh
minds.
yeah. So Title IX in itself isn't just about sports. So Title IX is about discrimination broadly in schools. You see Title IX, the other area you see Title IX, come up a ton is with sexual harassment on campus,
Mhm.
sexual assault on campus. Like Title IX deals with all those things. The reason sports comes up all the time is because Title IX it kind of paved the way for for women's sports in school settings, which means for women's sports generally, right? Because so many people access sports through school, requiring schools to provide like equal resources and equal opportunities to girls and boys. So the interesting thing about Title IX is that it doesn't require schools to even be like to even separate sports teams. Like schools can follow Title IX and have co-ed sports teams. They can have only co-ed sports teams and follow Title IX. So
Mm,
there's this interesting issue where like Title IX doesn't even do what the government says it does in sports. Title IX does not require schools to begin with to even have separate sports teams. But Title IX has this whole regulatory scheme around sports, like Congress explicitly authorized, the Javits Amendment explicitly authorized these really specific regulations around sports. And so we could see a really narrow ruling here about sports that not only doesn't extend beyond Title IX, but may not even extend beyond sports. Well, so we'll have to
mm.
wait and see.
Okay. Thanks for that. And just another kind of similar question. These two Supreme Court cases, they're targeting trans girls specifically, right? Like what does that mean for trans boys that there's still participation there? Is it yeah. Or is it trans
Um,
people as a whole?
Yes. So one interesting thing is, the government said like anyone can participate in boys sports, and that's kind of true and kind of not. Like
Hmm.
I know people have had to like girls have had to fight to play, let's say baseball. There's girls softball, there's not girls baseball. Like I don't think it's true that it's that easy, right? Like if schools do segregate sports that girls can just jump on the boys team, I think schools do make that difficult at times.
Hmm.
Um but theoretically, right, a lot of bars in women's sports don't necessarily transfer over to like a men's sports equivalent. And so there's a lot more like testing on female athletes than there is on male athletes just generally, where male athletes kind of hit a snag, trans men hit a snag in like elite sports is, if they're taking testosterone, that's often an issue related to uh what medications what you are and aren't allowed to take if you're an elite level athlete. At if you're not an elite level athlete, if you're just like a recreational player, a high school player, which is not to say, I know high school sports can be very serious, but you don't typically see that level of testing of athletes, of regulation of people's bodies that you would see, let's say, at an Olympic level. If For trans boys, we're not seeing bans on trans boys in boys sports, but we are seeing boys banned, right? Like there was that wrestler, Mac Beggs in Texas, who was a trans boy who wanted to do boys wrestling and they wouldn't let him and forced him to do girls wrestling. So I don't want to say just because there aren't these laws banning trans boys from boys sports that it doesn't happen. It certainly does, but we're not seeing these laws being enacted in the same way. These are bans on trans girls in girl sports to so-called protect girls. Like the whole premise of this is that girls are in need of protection, girls are weak, men are dangerous, trans women, trans girls are men, and it's uh all of these gender stereotyping, sex stereotyping, all of these things are going into this and they're impacting everybody, trans people, cis people, trans boys, trans girls. But the statutory bans we're seeing and the policies we're seeing are really targeting trans girls. But there are definitely hurdles to trans boys participating in boys sports as well.
Yeah. Was there anything I didn't ask that you think our listeners should know about these cases and what comes next and the landscape we find ourselves in?
Yeah, I mean, especially given this moment we're in right now, we just cannot let the government dehumanize people. And so this is about sports. It's not just about sports. Look at the rhetoric that has been going on for the past since Idaho passed their ban, I want to say for the past like 6 or so years. It's so terrible. It's so dehumanizing. We need to stand together. We need to say, no, we're not going to accept this. We're not going to let you generalize about groups of people. We're not going to get kind of lost in this rhetoric. Women's sports, there's a lot of improvement needed in women's sports, more funding, more resources, more women coaches, right? Like, no one is debating whether there are threats to women's sports, but the idea that, you know, B.P.J, like a middle schooler who wants to play volleyball, is a threat to women's sports, that it's worth millions of dollars for the state of West Virginia to be litigating this is just ludicrous. We need to see through this. We need to kind of keep a clear mind and keep an open mind and just watch what's happening and be careful because it is a slippery slope once you start letting the government dehumanize people. And that's really important to us here at Gender Justice. We support fully trans inclusion in women's sports. We think it's really important, and especially, for all at all levels, adults, kids, and whatever. But think about how formative sports are for kids in schools. It's so important. No one should be excluded.
Fully agree. And for folks that are listening, Gender Justice, we do have a lot of resources on our website around this topic and how to talk to others about this topic too, because it is unfortunately a hot button issue right now. We also host trans equity trainings where we talk more about like how to talk about this with friends and family that aren't with you, and engage in those conversations in a meaningful way. Because I think it's also going to take that. We have the courts, but we also have to talk to people and help them see who trans people are, see that humanity, and understand this issue for what it really is and what these attacks mean for all women and all people. I think with that, we'll be back in June and early July, whenever these decisions land, to break them down again on how these pan out. Thanks, Jess, for making time, and I hope everybody stays safe out there.
Yep, stay safe.